In the 1930s, the Great Plains were devastated by a killer drought that lasted for almost a decade. One of the nation's worst natural disasters.
The people who lived through the Dust Bowl have been scarred forever.
But climatologists have discovered that even more severe droughts have scorched the earth in centuries past.
When you look at droughts in other centuries, you see droughts that can go 10, 20, or 30 years even.
And experts agree we are due for another extreme drought soon. The effects could be devastating.
Inevitably, there will be water shortages. The only uncertainty is how much a shortage, where do those shortages happen, and how bad are they?
Mega drought on mega disasters. Throughout the 20th century, major droughts plagued the world. In 1936, a drought in China killed more than 5 million people. Ethiopia suffered severe droughts during the 1970s and 80s, and still experiences persistent drought. In recent years, the Darfur region of Sudan has experienced a recurring cycle of low precipitation. This drought has been a major factor in the devastating civil war there.
At the end of the day, wars in history have been caused by basically two things: religion and resources.
In the 1930s, the Plains region of Oklahoma, Kansas, the Texas Panhandle, and other western states were hit by one of the worst droughts on record. Thousands of farms went bust as parched crops wilted in the fields. Hundreds of thousands of people were left homeless. It was one of the worst natural disasters in the nation's history. Now, climatologists are concerned another extreme drought could already be starting in the western United States.
Certainly a lot of the western United States has had issues with serious drought problems in the last 7, 8, 9 years.
An extended drought in this region could be devastating to the nation's economy.
Economists always talk about this thing called the water diamond paradox. Diamonds very expensive, not terribly useful except as an ornament. Water very cheap, probably the most important substance on the planet that human beings need to live.
Water is already proving to be scarce for both farmers and urban residents across the West. And a recent government report states that while the 1930s drought lasted less than a decade, current drought conditions may go on for more than 100 years.
So one of the key issues now is if we were to have a recurrence of an event that was even more severe than the 30s in terms of duration and deficiency of precipitation, with all of the additional people that now are dependent upon water supplies, what that impact would be today, it would be much different than what it was 100 years ago or 200 years ago.
The conditions that set in motion the Dust Bowl started in the early part of the 20th century. Farmers were buying land and planting crops as fast as the banks would lend them money and the tractors could till the fields.
Most of this area was settled and broken in the late 19th and early 20th century, especially in the Texas Panhandle region between 1909 and 1929.
Farmers plowed their way across huge swaths of the interior West.
The great expansion in this region also occurs during the period of the First World War, when wheat prices just skyrocketed, averaging roughly $2 a bushel.
Farmers were also greatly helped by a long period of high rainfall.
With the precipitation cycle above average, farmers plowed the grass and they planted wheat, and they made money.
But on October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed, and the first rumblings of the economic catastrophe reverberated across the nation. Roy Vineyard and his family were residents of Amarillo, Texas, when the Depression first hit.
The money was scarce. The banks failed, and the country was just on a fix.
For farmers and ranchers, this was just the first blow to their livelihood.
Farmers were really rolling the dice that precipitation levels would remain high, and then nature turned against them.
In 1931, it stopped raining, With every sunrise came bright blue skies and almost no precipitation.
It was real dry. We were getting 10 and 12 inches when our normal rainfall is 20 inches.
The farmers of the southern Great Plains were living on a ticking time bomb of drought. A serious drought involves more than just an extended period of low precipitation.
The significance of drought lies in its impacts, and so the other important component of the definition is how that deficiency of precipitation over some period of time affects human activities in the environment.
During the 1930s, over-farming and increased water demands were exacerbated by a rise in temperatures and drier conditions around the world.
It's a complex issue because sea surface temperatures affect the climate all around the globe. The ocean circulation and the atmospheric circulation are inevitably linked together. And so when you have big anomalies in ocean sea surface temperatures, you're going to have some anomalies in the climate.
Computer models created by scientists at NASA indicate that during the 1930s, higher Atlantic sea surface temperatures influenced the jet stream to shift further south, bringing less moisture and hotter, drier weather further inland. This in turn increased the heat on the ground.
If you've got dry soils and higher temperature, it's that feeding on itself cycle. There's not a lot of moisture though. You get a really starved atmosphere, if you will.
There have been numerous periods of warmer, drier climate in the past, including the 1930s drought. But many experts fear that pollution and CO2 emissions could be contributing to a new, irreversible warming period. Unlike other natural disasters such as hurricanes, floods, earthquakes, and tornadoes, drought is also a tipping point disaster that can take years to reveal its full magnitude.
So usually it's months or maybe even seasons or even years before people realize they're experiencing a drought.
At first, a surplus of wheat in the early 1930s protected the farmers of the southern Great Plains from feeling the economic effects of the drought. Pauline Robertson is a survivor of the Depression and Dust Bowl years.
The Depression came to Amarillo and the top of Texas later than the stock market crash in October of '29 because our agricultural prices were holding up through 1930.
But even as they sold their bumper crop for a record profit, the growers' agricultural techniques and new tractor-driven technologies were undermining the very earth beneath their feet. Farmers would plow from property line to property line and would lose all the moisture that was held within the soil.
You have the availability of tractors so that an individual farmer could go out and plow large amounts of land and essentially using cultivation practices that they had learned in the more humid parts of the country.
But the earth was different in the arid West.
This is also an area in which soil composition is very friable. You pick it up in your hands. It sort of sticks together, but it comes apart very easily.
Proper dry land farming involves planting crops, primarily winter wheat, that can survive in fields that may receive as little as 15 inches of rain a year. The plants sustain themselves on the rain falling from the sky rather than on irrigated water. In late 1931, as the land dried up and still no rain, a new scourge invaded the plains: dust.
Once the dryness came, a lot of that soil blew away, hence the Dust Bowl years.
These winds would come and pick up this tons and tons of dirt and blow it south. There was a saying that Kansas farmers paid taxes in Texas because that's where their farms were.
It was as if a giant vacuum had sucked every drop of moisture from the region. The living got hard, really hard.
It was always dusty. You were always feeling the grittiness in your teeth. People covered their windows inside with wet sheets and wet towels to try to collect the dust before it came in, but you could clean house spotlessly one day and the dust would blow in the night or the next morning.
The dust wasn't just a nuisance, it could be deadly.
The problem with the dust is that it had a high silica content in it. which bothered the lungs in a number of ways.
A lot of people got what they call dust pneumonia. You just had to be very careful with babies because they were subject to dust pneumonia.
With food increasingly scarce, as 1931 turned into 32 and 33, there were deaths from this lung malady and other diseases.
It was a pretty grim time, and some people didn't have enough food to keep their bodies healthy, and when something like a disease would come by, they were just helpless against it.
By 1934, more than 65% of the United States was suffering from drought. But the hardest hit region was an oval-shaped area in the southwest.
When the Soil Conservation Service talked about the Dust Bowl, really they're referring to the southern Great Plains. It's an area that extends about 400 miles north and south and about 300 miles east and west. It's an area that extended about 97 million acres collectively. If you had a heart of the Dust Bowl, it would probably be the Dalhart, Amarillo, Texas area, Liberal, Kansas, Springfield, Colorado.
About 50 million of these acres were subjected to some form of wind erosion. Approximately 5 million acres were land that suffered extreme wind erosion and should never have been plowed. While some inhabitants of the Texas-Oklahoma Panhandle region did leave, many others stayed.
They were a pretty hardy stock out here. They were pretty ambitious to make it go.
For these rugged farmers, the only solution was to hunker down and make the best of a very bad situation.
In Dalhart, they had a newspaper editor who started a last man campaign, the last man to leave Dalhart.
But sticking it out would be tough. The drought appeared to be there to stay. And with strong winter and spring winds and the displacement of soil across vast areas, a frightening new phenomenon was starting to invade the Southwest: black blizzards. With the loss of topsoil across millions of acres during the 1930s drought, so-called black blizzards gripped the Great Plains.
The most severe years for the drought, heat, dust, wind erosion occurred from 1934, 35, 36, and 37, when you have most of the dust storm activity and the black blizzards that people usually associate with the Dust Bowl.
Black blizzards, huge, frightening clouds of black dust, sometimes a mile high, that would roll across the plains.
The big dust storms, what they call the big black dusters, were eerie.
These dust storms were a meteorological phenomenon common in arid or semi-arid regions. They are caused by convection currents created by intense heating from the ground and winds moving across the surface of the earth, picking up soil and carrying it into the air. Winds in a dust storm can top 75 miles per hour.
We still have dust storms today, just not on the frequency and the tremendous visibility that they had back in the 1930s.
On November 29, 1991, a terrifying dust storm struck Interstate 5 north of Los Angeles. Visibility was reduced to a few feet. Winds were nearly 80 miles per hour. The result was a massive accident involving 164 cars that killed 17 people and injured more than 150. More recently, scientists from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency have spotted huge dust storms from drought-stricken regions of Asia moving east across the Pacific Ocean toward North America. These storms are a stark reminder that regional drought issues can have worldwide consequences. But not much was known or understood about these giant storms in the mid-30s.
They would roll in like an oil fire, boiling towards you.
Black Sunday, April 14, 1935. More than 20 massive dust blizzards swept across millions of acres from South Dakota to Amarillo, Texas. 9-year-old Pauline Robertson was playing in the dusty wheat fields with a friend when the storm hit.
We looked over there, it looked as if a rain cloud was coming in, and we were all excited. Even kids had been taught to revere rain. Then we kept seeing how tall it was getting and how ominous it looked. And so we started running for home. But before we could get home, the black duster hit, and wind and gravel hit our legs. It was such a bizarre experience.
Roy Vineyard and his schoolmates were also playing in the fields when the storm hit.
A bunch of us boys were on the south side of Amarillo playing baseball. Here came this biplane that landed on the prairie right beside us. All us boys ran over there to see why the pilot had landed out there on that prairie. And he said, well, evidently you boys haven't looked out north. And that particular storm on April 14th, 1935, they said the wind was blowing 60 miles an hour, and that cloud of dust was 3,000 feet in the air. And the headlights of a car wouldn't penetrate it.
Within an hour, the storm started to dissipate. But as the months stretched into years, with no rainwater, an unforgiving environment, and a devastating economic depression, life was getting tougher and tougher across the southern Great Plains.
It was a time that was not just stressful, but in some respects very terrifying.
For almost 10 years, the dust kept blowing, the rain never came, and the inhabitants of the plains suffered. Finally, the government decided to step in and help.
The federal government became part of people's lives in ways that it hadn't before.
Before the 1930s, the general tendency by the federal government was to leave the issue of drought relief primarily to private organizations. So organizations like the Red Cross, for example, church groups, and so on.
Some of the very rich people thought the government was becoming socialistic, but I think that the common people realized that we had to have help.
As the decade dragged on and the rain failed to materialize, more people abandoned their farms for work in towns and cities further west. Agriculturally fertile areas such as central California started to see an influx of farm workers from eastern Oklahoma and other areas of the Southwest.
When the Oklahoma people came through with their cars loaded down going to California, I think people in the Panhandle thought, we're not leaving, we're sticking it out.
But many people did leave. Estimates are that between 300,000 and 1 million refugees left the plains for a better life in places like California. 15% of the population of Oklahoma moved west. Okie became a pejorative term for anyone migrating west, no matter where they were from. As the 1930s came to a close, the economy began to recover. By 1937 and 38, the worst of the Dust Bowl years were over. And with temperatures returning to normal, rains finally returned.
In the spring of 41, I believe, was when the rains finally came back to the region.
For many Americans, this period of history would fade to nothing more than the poignant backdrop for books like The Grapes of Wrath by John Steinbeck and haunting photographs by Dorothea Lange and other chroniclers of the era. But as the 21st century heats up, there are new fears that a mega drought that dwarfs the Dust Bowl may be just around the corner. Experts from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Agency, the National Drought Mitigation Center, NASA, and others are concerned that the American West and other regions of the world could plunge into a devastating drought over the next half-century. Climate fluctuation has contributed to periodic North American droughts for thousands of years.
We had some back in the 1200s, back in the 1500s and 1600s that were termed mega droughts. So we've had some periods of these multiple-year droughts that have really affected the U.S.
Archaeologists and climatologists use the science of dendrochronology to study these ancient meteorological events. This scientific analysis of tree rings can reveal many clues about ancient climates.
Dendrochronology is a way we can link current climate to past climate, and we call that proxy data.
This tree ring analysis uses a formula called cross-dating.
So one thing we can do is look at a current tree, and they can drill a core into a living tree and overlap it with a tree that they've either cut down or is dead that's been dated prior, and they just keep stepping backward and match it up and make sure they have the exact same years.
The scientists count the tree rings in a cross-section. Each ring is 1 year, with a unique width and spacing. Scientists then convert these specs into a sort of dot-dash code, similar to Morse code. Dendrochronologists can then compare the information to another tree from the same region. If the dots and dashes correspond, the scientist can overlap these matching sets of code, creating a living record of climate going back hundreds of years.
The whole key, though, is the cross-sections to determine the accuracy of when.
Climatologist Svoboda demonstrates this principle with a tree ring from north-central Kansas.
They have dated the start date here, as you can see, in the late 1800s. Around 1883, they've determined when the tree began its growth. And what's nice is then if they've gone and done some cross-checking with other trees in the area to overlap and do that, we can see, for example, the Dust Bowl years, how tight together those rings are. There's very little space between that whole 10-year period versus when you get out here between, say, 1951 and 39, we can see those rings get wider again, so we know we generally are in wetter times. But the Dust Bowl years really show up nicely on this particular sample.
By determining the frequency and duration of droughts over the last 1,000 years, they can more accurately predict when we might be due for another climate fluctuation. 600 years before the onset of the Dust Bowl caused so much destruction across the Great Plains, another drought was wreaking havoc on an earlier civilization. The ancient did their thriving culture in what is now the southwestern United States. Dr. George Gummerman of the Santa Fe Institute and the School of Advanced Research has been studying these Native American populations for more than 30 years.
Starting about 1000 AD, according to the tree ring records, the climate became very fine for corn agriculture, which was their major food source.
With a favorable climate, the Anasazi expanded rapidly and flourished over the next several hundred years. These early inhabitants of the Southwest took advantage of this wetter-than-normal period and their own technological innovations to greatly expand their agricultural reach.
By 1125, you might as well have covered the entire Southwest. Every little possible farm plot was being farmed. They had it down pat.
Despite its seemingly harsh and unforgiving topography, Chaco Canyon in New Mexico was an important cultural and economic center of Anasazi life. There was a simple explanation for this.
There are few places where you could control the water like you do in Chaco Canyon. The water coming through the wash itself and then the water coming off the cliff.
The Anasazi had many sophisticated water irrigation techniques.
On a relatively minor slope, they will pile rocks across little ravines, which allows soil to build up behind the rocks for the agriculture, but also slows the runoff of the water so that the water can sink in and fertilize the crops.
Just as in every other society, water was the most precious commodity.
If the rains came very heavily and washed out crops in a big wash, you'd still get crops in the bottom of the small wash or in sand dunes.
The use of sand dunes to grow corn is an excellent example of the Anasazi's gift for using their harsh semi-arid environment to their advantage.
Now, what looks drier than a sand dune? Not much, but it's the favored place to grow corn in this particular environment. Why? Because the sand holds in the moisture and they can plant the corn seed 6 to 4 inches deep.
But around 1150 AD, the Anasazi suddenly deserted their homes.
Along came the period for about a decade around 1150 AD when certain areas in the Southwest were abandoned. And they were areas of lesser rainfall. At 1150, the greatest complex prehistoric society in the Americas, Chaco Canyon, was completely abandoned, primarily triggered by climatic change. So around 1300, at Mesa Verde was another huge area of abandonment. Everybody left this part of the Southwest.
It appears prolonged periods of drought may have triggered a massive collapse of the sophisticated society the Anasazi had so carefully built. Within a few short years, the Anasazi had abandoned their cities and degenerated to a more primitive state.
You get episodes in the archaeological record of violence, some evidence of cannibalism, and the start of a new religion.
When scientists used computers to compare the real Chacoan society with a simulated society, they discovered a surprising fact.
What we see is a very close correlation between what happens on the computer and what happens in prehistory. In the artificial situation, the population drops dramatically, but 1/3 to a quarter of the people could physically continue to live there until the present, which means that environmental change was the trigger, but physically the people could have continued to live there, but they didn't.
Archaeologists speculate the Anasazi could not maintain their complex society in the face of rapid environmental changes, such as drought.
The real killing point for the Anasazi was when the water for crops didn't come. And that triggered a lot of social upheaval. The environment could have supported people, but for social, religious, political factors, it didn't. And everybody left.
Today, some experts believe a similar fate could be in store for major cities such as Los Angeles, Phoenix, and Las Vegas that have grown up in the arid regions of the Southwest. Severe water shortages combined with increased temperatures and lower rainfall could create so much chaos and upheaval that these population centers might actually become uninhabitable. And are the first signs of future water shortfalls already starting to appear across the western United States? Rising temperatures, melting snowpack, less rain, lower water tables, agricultural overuse, urban sprawl. The result of all this could be a crippling drought in the southwestern United States that dwarfs the Dust Bowl of the 1930s.
As we look to the future with more and more people moving into the Southwest, and then you couple that with the potential impact of climate change in terms of the drying out of the Southwest, warmer winters, less snowpack, and so on, it's going to change the whole hydrology of those basins. And so there's going to be less water, most likely, to allocate to a much larger population than was ever really expected.
Some scientists believe there are signs that we may already be on the verge of this mega drought.
There's been drought going on in the western United States since about 1998 or 99, so 7, 8, 9 years in some parts of the region.
One issue is an expected rise in the temperature of 5.4 degrees in the interior Southwest over the next half-century.
Where we're seeing the changes maybe occurs in the winter when these temperatures tend to be warmer.
Hotter temperatures in the interior West could have many impacts on the environment, including less rain at lower elevations and less snow in the mountains.
In the western United States, one of the key ways the temperature plays a role is with snowpack.
The vast snow-covered ranges of the Sierra Nevada and Rocky Mountains provide about 70 to 80% of the water available to California, Arizona, Colorado, and other western states.
This water stays up there as snow in the mountains. Then spring comes along, it melts, and it flows down into the areas that need the water during the summer months when they need it the most.
Increased temperatures could lead to more precipitation falling as rain rather than snow. This rain would move down the mountains faster and earlier in the spring.
This causes a challenge for water managers because now they're having to plan for flood control and dryness and water during the summer at the same time. So drought in the mountains of these Rocky Mountain states has impacts and implications far downstream of where the snow actually falls.
Scientists at NASA and other agencies believe a climate fluctuation toward drought conditions is already starting.
One of the theories would be with global warming, you would see a displacement of the jet farther north, allowing your source air to come in from the desert southwest, which would be the drier, warmer air.
Hotter, drier conditions generally result in less rainfall.
We haven't had a drought of the 30s in nature, and you're probably starting to think that we're due at some point here as we head into this century.
There is another factor that looms over the future of the interior and far west, or under it. The Ogallala Aquifer that runs from Nebraska in the north all the way south to Texas.
The Ogallala Aquifer, the way I like to describe it, is it's a huge Great Lake that's underneath the state of Nebraska. And it actually extends from Nebraska and parts of South Dakota south into Texas and New Mexico and parts of Colorado. And so the water over many, many years seeps through the Sandhills part of Nebraska and goes into this aquifer system that then extends far into Texas and New Mexico.
This massive underground lake or series of interconnected lakes holds more than 3.3 billion acre-feet of water, more than the volume of Lake Huron. The catch here is the Ogallala Aquifer, or High Plains Aquifer as it is sometimes called, has very little recharge. This means that most of what comes out is not replaced. Groundwater from the aquifer was first widely used in Texas in the 1930s. Since then, approximately 11% of the total groundwater supply has been extracted. A hydrograph of a single well in southwest Kansas shows us the depletion of this source of water. In 1930, the depth to the water table was only 75 feet. In 1950, the water table was relatively unchanged. But with the rapid expansion of irrigated acreage between 1950 and 1985, the water table dropped significantly. It now takes drilling to about 110 feet to reach water. A period of heavy precipitation and better technology since 1985 seems to have stabilized the water usage somewhat, but it is unlikely that this will last. A large part of the increased use of this underground water has come about because of technological changes in the way agricultural land is irrigated. Center pivot irrigation has been a leading factor in the decrease of underground water from sources such as the Ogallala Aquifer.
Center pivot irrigation has really changed the way farmers pursue their livelihood in much of the western Great Plains. Essentially, it's technology that emerges out of the 50s and it starts to become affordable in the 60s for a number of farmers. It simply involves digging a well until you reach a water level that will sustain irrigation.
The irrigation sprinklers pivot hydraulically around the wellhead.
The systems are really exceptional in size. They can cover a quarter section and more, depending upon the capital that a farmer has to invest.
Experts are concerned that center pivot irrigation could eventually deplete the underground water resources the West has come to depend on.
What it means is that today in the western Great Plains, instead of people doing dryland farming, planting wheat and letting nature take its course, they can plant corn.
Corn, alfalfa, and other feed crops requiring heavy irrigation have brought slaughterhouses and packing companies to areas where they had never been before. But there is a downside to this productivity.
Problem has been that they've been so successful that the Ogallala aquifer is depleting very rapidly, and it doesn't have a recharge rate.
If the underground aquifer becomes depleted while we are suffering from a long-term drought, the consequences could be catastrophic. Hotter temperatures, less rain, less snow, lower water tables, climate change. Experts agree this could be a recipe for a drought disaster of epic proportions. And it may have already started. Scientists agree a dangerous combination of man-made factors and climate fluctuation could lead to long-lasting mega-droughts within the next 10 years.
Inevitably, there will be water shortages even without the kinds of perturbations of the climate that we're going to see over the next decade. With that in play, the only uncertainty is how much a shortage, where do those shortages happen, and how bad are they?
If urban sprawl in desert areas escalates, agricultural irrigation increases, and hotter, drier weather continues to plague the Southwest, a perfect drought could emerge.
A perfect drought is when you've got dryness that's affecting all of those water resources.
Las Vegas and Phoenix, two cities carved out of the desert, are drought danger zones waiting to implode.
Las Vegas has been growing tremendously in recent years, but back when the Colorado River Compact was developed, Las Vegas was a small village.
As water becomes more scarce, these desert cities will find themselves competing for this precious resource. Lake Mead in the Colorado River supplies the city of Las Vegas with almost all of its water, and the Imperial Valley in Southern California, considered one of the most important agricultural centers in the United States, relies almost completely on water from the Colorado River. California is the 8th largest economy in the world. Without water, farm productivity and urban water use across the entire Southwest could dry up.
There have been a lot of schemes, ideas that have been generated on how do you move water, for example, from the Great Lakes to western Texas. But I think as these conflicts become more severe in the future, we're going to have more of these schemes identified, and people are going to try and promote some of these ideas.
But even with the intervention of new ideas and conservation efforts, a multi-decade drought in the West would be a major catastrophe.
What occurs in that sort of a scenario is that the first year of drought certainly affects the economy of people. It draws down the reservoirs, it draws down the water supply that's available in streams.
But the conflict between agricultural and urban and suburban water needs is bound to increase as the length of the drought increases.
It's going to be a big conflict issue, and we're only going to see more of that as we go through the next 50 years.
Today, the Colorado River Basin at Lake Mead is at half capacity and is 110 feet below its maximum elevation of 1,229 feet. In a multi-year drought, lower precipitation levels and decreased snowpack could cause the river to drop even more.
When you go into a second year of drought, you have those portions of the hydrologic system that are already out of balance from where they should be. And so a second year of drought produces impacts that are magnified significantly over the first year.
As the drought drags on, water rationing could become mandatory. Dry brush across huge swaths of the West will be especially vulnerable to forest fires.
What's changing in terms of wildfire is how we're moving into those areas where we have trees. The rural-urban interface is changing, and so we've got a lot of people who are wanting to move into the settings that are nice.
In the third year of the drought, a massive fire spreads across much of Southern California, Nevada, and Arizona. In Los Angeles, a fire burns more than 25,000 acres across the Hollywood Hills. Almost 1,000 homes are destroyed. Thick black smoke covers the city.
So if you go into a third year, a fourth year, a fifth year, this becomes very severe in that the resiliency of the agricultural community, the urban community, and so on to deal with this over a period of time, multiple years, disappears.
10 years into the drought, the Las Vegas casinos pull up stakes and move to fairer climates in the East and Canada. 20 years into the drought, with the loss of its economic engine, Las Vegas becomes the first major American city to become a ghost town. The drought disaster moves into a third decade. Federal and state governments become increasingly desperate to save the economic and cultural infrastructure of an area that accounts for 70 to 80 million Americans. The search for water could become a dominant theme for countries, states, local municipalities, and even individuals.
We don't typically think of pirated water as a major problem in the United States today. Could it be so in the future? Scarcity does funny things to the way people behave in those situations.
A prolonged drought could bring economic chaos to vast areas of the western United States. Individuals would wander the dry back roads, trading gas and other commodities for increasingly valuable fresh water.
You know, you can live for a few days or even a week without eating anything solid, but you can't live for that long without drinking water. It's the most important resource for life.
Social, cultural, and political systems will be near the breaking point.
We sort of believe that everybody is entitled to have water at a reasonable price. As sources get more scarce and as water gets more expensive, that bargain usually tends to unravel, much as it has in other parts of the world. We could see fights here like we have in other parts of the world over those supplies.
A once abundant natural resource has nearly disappeared. It's the Wild West all over again. Only this time, water has truly become more precious than gold. Nation could face off against nation over dwindling supplies of water.
Here in the United States, it seems pretty unlikely that Colorado and California are going to go to war over water. But Mexico and the United States, that's a less unlikely kind of scenario.
But this nightmare vision of the future may not be inevitable. At the National Drought Mitigation Center, scientists are working to ensure that this scenario remains science fiction.
I think over the next 10 to 20, 30 years, we're going to be doing a much better job in predicting droughts.
Early warnings could help farmers and urban areas make changes to avoid overtaxing their infrastructure systems.
Las Vegas is one of the best examples of being very aggressive in trying to get homeowners to think about other types of vegetation other than grass surfaces to go on their lawns, and providing incentives for their population to try to conserve water. And the reason for that, frankly, is because they've experienced this drought over the last 7, 8, 9 years.
Water as a traded commodity may become a bigger part of the picture.
The idea of banking and marketing and moving water, trading water between states or between countries will become very much a hot topic as we move farther into this century.
Natural climate fluctuations may move in a more favorable pattern. A drought in the Missouri River Valley during the early 1990s decimated the local water supplies, and scientists worried it would take decades to get back to normal levels.
Well, 1993 was a flood year, and it was a flood year to end all flood years, and those reservoirs returned to normal in 1 year. But you can't rely on that sort of an extreme event to occur. You never know when that's going to happen. You can estimate that, but we have no control over Mother Nature.
We may have no control over Mother Nature, but these experts hope that conservation efforts can help mitigate the effects of depleted reservoirs and climate change. If not, the resulting mega-drought could have a catastrophic impact, not only on the Southwest, but also the entire nation.
Yusuf, come see. You got that whole thing.
Not beach diving today.
No,